right, so we'll get started. Welcome everyone to this webinar on DevOps best practices to better manage your Okta tenants. I'm Gil Hofer. I'm the co-founder and CTO of Salto. Before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, this webinar is being recorded and we will share a link with everyone after it is done. So you'll be able to go back and review anything that we shared here. Also, feel free to use the chat, ask questions. We'll try to address them as we go, but if I won't get to them, we will do it at the end of the webinar. Every question is valuable, so don't be shy. This webinar we'll try to keep it a little bit interactive. We'll talk, we'll have a poll, we'll have a live demo, so stick around. So a little bit of background on myself and on Salto. So Salto, we're a startup company. I'm one of its founders. We started it 5 years ago. Right now, we're about 80 employees. We're venture-backed by great investors, and we have offices in Tel Aviv, San Francisco, Florida, and in London. Now, what Salto is really about? So, as you all know, every modern company is basically being run by a very large collection of SaaS applications. The numbers that are typically being thrown out there are in the hundreds or many hundreds of SaaS applications in any modern company today. Now, these can be business applications, for example, your Salesforce for your CRM, or NetSuite or Oracle ERP for your finance, Zendesk, ServiceNow. Most of these are business applications. This can also be IT applications that help you run your IT stack. Looking at applications such as Splunk, Jira, SailPoint, and obviously Okta, which we all care about today. So that's how every modern business basically is being run today. But in order for the companies to use and utilize these applications, they require deep customizations. And the reason for that is, as you all well know, every business is different. So the configuration that is required from, let's say, Okta in one company, let's say a pharmaceutical company, is very different from the configuration which is required from Okta in a large manufacturer or in a big tech company. Now, the complexity of that configuration can be daunting in some cases. So in order to enable administrators with varying technical expertise to do that, most of these applications today use no and low code tools and techniques. Meaning that if 20, 30 years ago, in order to configure or customize those applications, you would need to write code, today it is typically being done using point and click interfaces or very low code tools in order to enable less technical folks to be able to and do that and do their day-to-day job. It's important to remember, though, that the actual complexity and the logical complexity in the configuration isn't reduced by doing that. Rather, it stays relatively high. Now, the fact that we're doing that with no and low code tools brings unique challenges on their own, and let's touch on a few of these. The first one might sound a little bit silly, but we're seeing it in all of the companies that we work with in Salto, and working with hundreds of enterprise companies, is that it can become very hard to know what is it that you already have implemented in your system. In many cases, we're looking at instances or tenants with 10 years of history, with hundreds, thousands of policies, of applications, of rules. How do we really know what is it that right now we have implemented in our instance? in our tenant. Moreover, how can we know why a certain change to that configuration was made, implemented, by whom, when, what will be the impact of a change that will do to that configuration? Let's say we would like to change some rule or some policy. What will be the impact of such a plain change? What would it be inside Okta on some other configuration elements within the system? Or what will be the impact on other systems that are integrated with Okta? All of these are challenges around visibility and understanding what is it that we already have implemented in our tenants. And many of us deal with multiple tenants, right? We're doing M&As, we have multiple subsidiaries. The complexity grows very quickly. Moreover, how can we develop changes reliably without impacting production? So in many cases, we will try and use preview instances, but it can be relatively challenging to get to a state where the preview instance is representative of the setup that we have in production. There are no really native ways to synchronize those instances. So unfortunately, many of us go and do change directly in production, which is a very risky endeavor. How can we collaborate when we need to implement a change? How can we review those changes as a team, collaboratively, and create collective code ownership? Because I'm sure that many of you have a team of 4, 5, 6, 10. We've been working with organizations with 20 in the IAM and Okta administration group. How can you make sure that the entire team is aware of changes coming in, can review them, and can provide their insights on certain changes? Let's say that we got to a stage where we can reliably use our preview tenant. How can we reliably promote changes from that preview tenant to our production without basically meticulously documenting those in spreadsheets and tickets and replaying them in a very error-prone manual process? And as you know, things can go south. How can we roll back easily if needed? How can we keep proper paper trail for compliance to make sure that every change that we perform to our production tenants was indeed approved, and that we can go back and prove that in the future? How can we know what is already broken in our implementation? Let's say that we have some rules or policies that refer some stale groups. So as you can see, many, many, many different challenges. And the thing is that most of these are logical challenges. They have little to do with the fact that we developed the configuration using clicks and using a no-low-code interface. But the thing is that we might be missing some standard tools that in other worlds where we use code are more available. And it's interesting because as we analyze the problem, we realize that these are actually very similar challenges to those that we saw about 20 years ago in the world of IT infrastructure. If we go back about 20 years, some of you probably remember, a typical IT person would start his day with a box in his hand, a server, would go down to the data center, put it into a rack, pull out one of those nifty foldable keyboards and start typing commands to install that server. These were very manual and error-prone processes done in organizational silos in IT versus the rest of the organization with some very long delivery cycles. I remember asking for a server around 24 and getting a reply that, yeah, we have an SLA of 90 days for provisioning a new server, which was mind-blowing, right? For me, because we're trying to practice agile software development, etc. It led to very rigid, infrequent releases, and which in turns reduced quality. And what happened back then is that the more advanced organizations, IT organizations, started adopting methodologies and best practices coming from the world of software development. They basically started treating their IT infrastructure as code, and started with automation tools such as Chef and Puppet around, let's say, 2008, 9, these areas, and advanced to tools such as Terraform and Pulumi, which are the de facto standard for infrastructure as code. And that all of a sudden allowed us to take all of those manual processes and automate them, leading to much faster release cycles. It led to the fact that those infrastructure definitions became artifacts in a source control repository, leading to visibility within the team, etc. It completely transformed the way that we view the management of IT assets. And the thing is that the challenges here are pretty much the same when looking at IT and business applications configurations. Let's see, why does as code really matter? That's just a subset. There are many other advantages for using code for managing the configuration of our IT application. And by code, code might be a little bit like a scary word, but what is code? So code is basically a textual representation that has a structure. That structure has a syntax, meaning that there's a definition of what is a legal sentence in our language. And it also has a semantic, meaning it has a logical meaning. So once we have that configuration represented as code, immediately we can version control it, typically using Git. It makes it immutable, meaning that changes are very controlled. It makes auditing much easier and makes rollbacks feasible, because rollbacking a change becomes as simple as basically deploying a past version back into our production system. It enables linters and tools to analyze that code to enforce consistency, to automatically detect potential issues with our configuration. It makes that implementation collaborative, because all of a sudden we have a common language. It's not that policy, yeah, go to that screen on Okta, search for that policy and start going over the different UI elements in Okta. Rather, we have a text that we can collaborate on, that we can curate. And in turn, it increases the buzz factor. For those of you who doesn't know what's a buzz factor, it's a little bit morbid way to look at things. But the buzz factor is how many people in your team can be, well, hit by a bus, and the knowledge in the team remains, and you can sustain the work. So in a world where you don't have any collaboration within your team, the buzz factor is basically one, because everyone knows something different, and you lose knowledge if someone is leaving the team unexpectedly. By having that formal representation of your configuration, you have the history of it, you have a common language to talk about it, you increase the survivability of that knowledge within your team. Another clear advantage of having a textual representation of a configuration is that all of a sudden, those configuration changes, they become predictable, repeatable, and consistent, meaning you implement something in your development environment, typically a preview sandbox. That representation of the change that you just did, it encapsulates everything that you would like to change in the higher environments, in your UAT and in your production. So instead of clicking again and again and again on the same buttons in all of the different environments, it's as easy as just deploying the same configuration, clicking a single button, and that configuration can be as big or as small as you'd like, making this entire process much more repeatable and consistent. In other words, what we're saying here is that pure no code is basically holding us back from benefiting from one of the most significant advances that IT saw in the past 20 years, which is DevOps. And it might be a little bit counterintuitive, right? Because most of you are coming from a large IT organizations. You know and value DevOps and what it has done for your product delivery and for your infrastructure and the way that you manage your organization. It is almost mind-blowing, the fact that we're not using those best practices and those benefits when managing the critical systems that we're using as part of our IT organization. And that is coming simply from the fact that all of the tooling that we've built in DevOps, they assume that we have a code representation of our system. And by using pure no code, we're missing on that. And this is the core of what we're saying at Salto. That instead we can imagine a world where we still use no code to develop. There are great, amazing tools, and Okta is a great example. It has immense flexibility in the way that it allows us to develop very complicated IAM policies, etc. But we can use pro code techniques in order to manage that configuration at scale. In other words, what we're saying in Salto is that we have to adopt a DevOps mindset and tooling for IT and business applications. Basically taking those methodologies, tooling from the dev and DevOps world into the way that we manage our business and IT applications. So far, we talked about some of the challenges. I'd like to share a few questions with you, and we'll go back to the answers at the end of the session. I think the answers, first of all, should be interesting for everyone and can also shed some more light on the importance of the problem that we're looking at. I'll give you about 30 more seconds before we continue. Ooh, some very interesting answers. All right, most of you have answered. You can still continue and answer. We'll get back to the answers in about 20 minutes. So hang on with us. All right. Let's imagine a world where we have implemented a DevOps approach for IT applications. Let's see what can be the benefits of that. So the first one is that we will have a clear and complete textual representation of the implementation that we have in Okta. It can be declarative, it can be code in some systems, which enables visibility and easily answers questions such as what is implemented. As easy as Control F or Command F. Once we have that representation, we can version control it in a source control system such as Git and be able to answer questions on changes over time. We can use code analysis tools in order to answer questions on dependencies and change impact. What will be the impact of deleting that group? What is that push group really, what is it really doing, etc. As we talked about, it will create shared responsibility within our team. Everyone should be aware of all the major changes. More interesting, it will enable us to always develop in high fidelity sandboxes or preview tenants in Okta language. Because we have that representation, we can just deploy it to our sandbox and from a sandbox to our production. Now, having those high fidelity preview tenants enables us to develop without impacting production, as well as not testing on non-representative setup, meaning that the setup that we use for testing is going to be highly representative of what we have in production. A little bit more advanced for those of you who are familiar with popular DevOps techniques, a change proposal in our configuration for Okta becomes a feature branch in Git. meaning that it is isolated, well documented, and that feature branch translates into a pull request, meaning a request to change something in our system. That pull request can be tied back to a change request in, let's say, Jira or ServiceNow. Promoting a change from our dev environment to our UAT environment to our production environment is as easy as Git merging that branch and deploying. Meaning we have a very repeatable standard process to promote changes from any environment to any environment. We can also back promote if we do a change in a high end and would like to back promote it back to our development environment, for example. The holy grail, and we're seeing it with our customers, is having a CI/CD, a continuous integration and continuous delivery pipeline for those configuration changes. All those best practices that your developers and DevOps engineers are used to, all of these are relevant to the way that you manage Okta. If you need to roll back, it's basically as simple as running a git revert, meaning going back to a past version and deploying those changes. As we mentioned, maintaining proper paperwork for changes, it's as easy as tying those change requests in Jira or ServiceNow to commits or to pull requests. Configuration backup, and I'm sure that many of you care about having proper backup, it's almost a side effect in this case. Because we have that constant versioning of our configuration, you have that backup and you can always deploy from it. Now, everything that we discussed so far is actually not Okta specific. And the same challenges, and in Salto, we're working with customers of all of these applications that I have listed below. In all of them, we're seeing the same challenges of how can we use sandboxes efficiently? How do we know what it is that we've implemented? And it might be a little bit surprising, but the challenges of a Salesforce administrator and a NetSuite developer and a Jira administrator and an Okta administrator and a Zendesk administrator, they are surprisingly similar. So as an industry, we should have a standard way to practice DevOps and use the same processes and the same tools across our entire IT and BT application stack. BT stands for business technology. Now, how can we get there? What can be our implementation strategies for getting there? Well, unfortunately, I think the first one is the most common one, which is to do nothing. And if there's something that I'd like you to take from this session, is that you need to start doing something because you're paying for the fact that you're not doing anything. You're moving slower, or that you're taking unnecessary risks with a critical system that controls the entire identity scope of your organization. What can you do when you start doing something? So in some cases, we're seeing customers trying to build their own using the relevant APIs. It can work for specific use cases. If you have specific configuration types, very specific ones that are the core in your organization, you might be able to pull something on your own, basically reading those, but you will get some JSONs from the relevant APIs. You can version control them in Git, and you might even change them and deploy back. It will be very limited, error-prone, and time-consuming. But it is doable. That's the basis. Some organizations are using Terraform for managing Okta. Now, Terraform, it's a great product. We use it internally, by the way, in Salto to manage our entire IaaS stack, so Amazon Web Services, etc. The challenge with using Terraform for Okta is that it requires you to build and maintain the code representation for Okta mostly by hand. And that in turn means that you need, sorry about that, that you need to have expertise in both Terraform and in Okta. Now, that can be challenging because typically Terraform requires quite a bit of knowledge, and the persons who know Terraform well wouldn't know Okta well. Okta requires quite a bit of knowledge. The employees that knows Okta well won't necessarily know Terraform well. So we're looking at an intersection of these two worlds. Doable. All of you have smart people in your organizations. It's a lift. An advantage of using Terraform is that it's applicable to other IT services, mostly IaaS. So to AWS, Azure, etc. The fourth alternative, which I'll zoom into in the next part of this session, is using Salto. And the main difference or advantage of Salto over Terraform is that it enables you to continue using the Okta UI to make changes in the lower environments and automatically synchronize the code representation, meaning that you can do changes in Okta. Salto will automatically generate and understand the code representation of it. You can do changes in Salto and deploy them back to Okta. Thus, it requires less expertise compared to Terraform, as it is UI and not CLI based. And while Terraform is applicable to other IT services, Salto is applicable to other IT and business applications. So we're looking at SaaS. All right, so far it was, I think that we established that we have a challenge. We established a direction for how can we address that challenge. Let's see how can we do it in practice. I'm going to run a live demo. Well, things can go wrong in a live demo, but hopefully everything will go smoothly. All right, so here we are. So I'm in Salto right now. A little bit of orientation before we dive deeper. As I mentioned, Salto can manage different business applications, and you can see here a bunch of different environments that I have in Salto, like for Jira, and Salesforce, and Okta, and Zendesk, etc. But in this session, we're going to focus on Okta, and I have here two environments that were connected to Salto. We have here a dev preview and a production environment. Now, as soon as we connect Salto to an Okta tenant, Salto will fetch that configuration into Salto and will generate the tree structure that you see here on the left side. We can run that fetch manually. We can also run it on a scheduler, like nightly, like daily or hourly, etc. Now, for all of the different configuration elements in Okta, we generate those records here on the left side. On the left side, this should seem familiar, right? We can see our access policies, our applications, our brands, authorization servers, group rules, password policies, really everything that you can typically customize and configure in Okta. Let's try and look at one of these. For example, we have here a custom authentication policy. Now, as I mentioned, behind the scenes, Salto has a textual representation of everything that we have here. This one is very simple. But the interesting part is that we automatically understand all of the different dependencies of those different configuration elements. For example, here we can say that this authentication policies, it is dependent on these 5 different access policy rules, and is being used by this specific application. And we can drill down. For example, I can go to this access policy rule. I can see all of its content. By the way, this would be a textual representation of it. Relatively simple and very readable. That's a language called NACL, N-A-C-L. And we can see, for example, that this one depends on a specific group and a specific network zone. I can drill down to that network zone and see, well, it is being used by these different 5 other configuration elements, right? These 2 password policy rules, this one sign-on policy rule, etc. So that's the first step of creating proper visibility and understanding potential impact of changes. Everything here is searchable. I can go ahead and search for anything. And this is around creating that common language and basic common mechanism for collaboration within our team. But now let's go to something a little bit more interesting. So for this session, we're going to have a case where we need to develop a new access policy and would like to develop it in our development preview tenant and deploy it to our production tenant. Now, as any other organization, like you need to have control in the way that you do that. So I went ahead, this is Jira, right? And I created a ticket to create a new foobar access policy. It's an urgent new auth rule for the foobar project. We can see that it is tied to Okta, and let's say it was approved. I went and developed the relevant components of the change in my preview tenant, and now I'd like to go ahead and deploy it to my production tenant. So I went to this compare and deploy tab, and I would like to create a new deployment. Now, Salto supports a few different deployment strategies. The one I'm going to show you is comparing two different tenants, two different environments, and deploys based off those changes. I will quickly describe the two others. The first one is that we can find changes that happened in a specific environment since a point in time. For example, let's say you started a project on Jan 10, and you would like to see all the changes that happen in your preview tenant since Jan 10. You can just see those and then filter and deploy to their environment. We can also edit the texture representation of an environment directly in Salto or open a web-based IDE. This can be very useful for like bulk changes. Let's say that you had an M&A, you need to make a lot of changes to an instance. That can be a great way for doing that. But for this demo, we're going to stick to compare and deploy. Let's create a new one. So we're going to deploy from our Okta dev tenant to our Okta prod tenant. The title of our deployment is going to be our foobar deployment. And we're also going to link it to our Jira ticket that we created just before. So I'm going to create a new compare and deploy operation. As soon as I did that, Salto shows me all of the differences between my dev environment and my production environment. So you can very easily understand what are the differences between your preview instance, preview tenant, and your production tenant. By the way, this works between any two tenants. So if you have multiple production tenants, or if you have some kind of a like hub and spoke architecture where you need to deploy changes like that, you can do exactly the same with that. We're seeing that we have here 506 configuration additions that were done in our preview tenants but are missing in our production tenant, 58 modifications, meaning that the same configuration, 58, meaning the same modification, the same elements exist in both, but have some differences between them, and 309 deletions, meaning that they exist in prod, but not in dev. Let's take a look, for example, at a certain modification. We can see the actual changes, in this case, just a priority change of that, but we can see very clearly what are the changes between the two configuration elements. But for the sake of this demo, we have a new access policy that we created. This is our foobar policy. But everything here is searchable, filterable. We can see the details of this one. I'm just going to select it. As soon as I select it, Salt automatically detects dependencies and tells us, well, this foobar access policy, it's actually being used by these two other access policy rules and by this application. I'd like to go ahead and select those access policy rules. I wouldn't like to deploy this application for now. So, oh man, we have a missing dependency. What does it mean? And we can see it here. We can see that the foobar access policy has some other dependencies. It depends on the foobar user type. So we'll select it. And right now, seems like we're good. There are some other optional dependencies that we can deploy, but right now we're basically staged for deployment. I'd like to preview this deployment. Now, there are multiple different flows that we can take from here. I'm going to show you a way to add some more control over the change. So I configured Salto to automatically go ahead and open a pull request in order to approve this change. What are we seeing in the screen? We're seeing, first of all, that these are the 4 configuration elements that are staged for deployment. All of these are additions. But I cannot deploy right now because we have a pull request which is pending. For those of you who are unfamiliar, pull request is a mechanism to review changes in GitHub. We support all the different Git providers. So I clicked on that link from Salto and got to GitHub. And we can see that, well, that's the change. And we can see the actual content, everything that is part of this change. This is linked back to that deployment in Salto, but we see that a review is required. All right, so let's assign a reviewer. I'm going to assign our trusty Knuckles McKnuckle to review this change request. Knuckles is logged in here on this other browser. Let's just refresh this screen. All right, we can see that there's a review required on this pull request. I'm going into there. You can see that Gil requested my review on this pull request. So I'm going to add my review. It looks good to me. So I'm going to review those changes. Looks good to me. Approve. And I just need to move something from Zoom here. All right. And I can submit my review. All right. So this pull request is the changes are approved. And we can go back. We can see that also in that GitHub account, it is approved. And when we go back to Salto, we can see that right now it's ready for deployment because it was approved. We could have also deployed it automatically, by the way, as part of a CI/CD pipeline. But now that it's approved, I'm just going to click deploy and push. Salto warns me that I'm deploying to a sensitive environment, to my production environment, that we're about to deploy these 4 new elements. I'm clicking deploy now, and that's basically it. Salto now is using the APIs to deploy those changes, and will merge also the changes on the Git side. It typically takes like a minute. All right, deployment successful. Everything was deployed. And it is syncing now back with Okta, making sure that everything was deployed correctly. Everything was deployed correctly. And now it is also pushing those changes back to GitHub. Push to GitHub, and we can see those changes back in GitHub. Now, as you remember, we started this with a ticket on Jira, and we can see now that that ticket that we created is, if I just go and refresh my Jira screen, that it is linked to that pull request that was merged and to the commits that we made. All right, so very quickly, to recap, we saw how we understood the configuration of an Okta tenant, and how we easily deployed changes between tenants. And we can be as granular or as really, we can deploy at whatever scale that we'd like. One thing that I'd like to show you before we go back and talk about the poll results is that because we have that textual representation of everything, we can also monitor the configuration for certain changes. For example, I can create different notification rules that would alert me when something changes. For example, let me create a new notification. Let's call it, I don't know, changes to password policies, for example. And I'd like to get alerted on any change that happens in Okta to any, well, as the name says, any password policy, and you know what, any password policy rule. I'd like to get an email, or I can be notified on Slack. Let's do Slack. And I have my Gil tracker channel. And that's basically that. every time that Salto will detect that a change was made to that relevant area, I will get an alert with all the details. All right, so that was a very quick demo of using DevOps principles for managing changes and in Okta and understanding Okta in a very controlled way, right? Adding approvals to that, adding visibility, tying back a change to a Jira ticket, etc. All right, now all of this it's achievable today. In Salto, we're working with many different types of companies, and from mega corporations, pharmaceuticals, to like Sanofi or Takeda, to very traditional retailers, like if you're familiar with Leroy Merlin or Lireco, to cutting edge tech companies like MongoDB and Nutanix and Monday.com. So really, it's achievable today. It doesn't matter on which type of company you are, because you are all sharing the same pains. And that's a good segue to discuss the results of the poll that we ran earlier. So to remind us, we had two questions. The first one on how often do you make changes in your Okta configuration? And most of you are very agile in the way that you work, right? It's 60% do that at least once a week, with 28% daily. Just 17% of you do that a few times a year or less often, meaning that you really do need a way to streamline the way that you manage your changes. Now, this is very interesting because the vast majority of you are managing multiple production tenants. Only 22% of the respondents are managing a single production tenant. 78% of the respondents manage two or more, with it's 45% managing six or more production tenants. Now, doing that manually, it's daunting. It means that you're working very, very hard in order to streamline the way that you manage your changes. All right, so to recap, what we talked about today is that we should really start managing our Okta configuration and other applications, by the way, not just Okta, but we should really start managing these as code. We should apply DevOps best practices to the way that we manage them, and we can start today, even by taking some small steps. Now, before we go into Q&A, and I can see that there are many questions in the chat channel. I need a few seconds to go over them. How can you stay in touch with us? So first of all, we have a free trial and a free tier. You can sign up on our website, or you can use this QR code that will take you directly there. You can also follow us on LinkedIn or on Twitter. We're mostly active on LinkedIn. Let's see some questions that we had from the crowd. All right, so Raza asked if we back up Okta workflows and group rules. The answer is yes for group rules. Unfortunately, we cannot back up Okta workflows today. There's no public API for that. We are in touch with the Okta product management team to try and make sure it happens. It's a very common request. For Raza also asked if for group rules or group backup, do we retain the same group ID when we revert back? The answer is yes. There's a lot of logic in Salto on how do we manage IDs, and there are many strategies for us for doing that. The answer for groups, by the way, depends if the groups are managed in Okta or in an external directory. We typically will not deploy changes to groups that are managed in an external directory because it would lead to discrepancies. And in that case, we would tell you to restore from the directory and not from Salto. Okta customizations and brandings on multi-branding is managing through the tool. The answer is part of it today, and we're extending the coverage around multi-branding. So today it is partial, but it will be much more complete in the next few months. There was a question if the recording will be available and sent. Yes, it will be sent. Aldi asked, what is the average implementation time of Salto in an average 2 Okta tenant environment? So it can vary. It varies. It really depends on what it is that you're trying to do. From what we're seeing, typically the time to value is very quick. Meaning, just connecting Salto to your tenants, it's immediate. It takes a few minutes. You get all that configuration into Salto. Deploying between tenants, also, as you saw, it's pretty immediate. The things that can take a little bit more time, from what we saw, is in some organizations, your different tenants, let's say preview and production, can be completely out of sync. So you might need to use Salto in order to seed your preview tenant with data. That can take some time because that's a project. And another one is that if you'd like to build like a CI/CD pipeline, it also involves some behavioral change in the organization. So that also can take some time. Typically in an implementation, our recommendation would be to have this kind of crawl, walk, run, sprint type of implementation, and to get quick value from just fetching and deploying between organizations, because it provides you instantly with approvals, with controls, eliminating all that manual work. And to that, we're talking about days, maybe a few weeks. It's a lightweight implementation. All right, so I think we covered most of the questions, and we're running out of time. I very much hope that this was informative and useful. Do not hesitate to reach out to us. We would love to collaborate and see how can we help. There are two more questions. Where can I find them? Oh, all right. Sorry, we can cover these. So Aaron asked, does Salto only work for SaaS PaaS type products? Can it extend to on-prem applications as well? Also, if it can work for on-prem packages, can be used to replicate configuration in on-prem and cloud-based. So typically Salto is for SaaS applications. The one exception today is that we do support Jira on-prem, meaning you can use Salto to manage your Jira DC on-prem configuration. We do not support today, though, deploying changes between Jira DC and Jira SaaS, because those configurations are typically not exactly the same. You need to transform them. There is a lot of value, though, in using Salto to manage both Jira DC and Jira SaaS, because you will have a streamlined process for managing both. And the last question is from John on, do we have alert notification integration for MS Teams, like I just showed for Slack? So the answer is that today, no, but our Microsoft Teams customers, they typically use an integration between Mail and Slack and Teams. So you can send an email from Salto and have that email trigger a Microsoft Teams notification. So that's really all the questions. So as I mentioned, I really hope it was informative. And if there's one thing that you can take, that you should take from this session, is that not doing anything is not the right thing right now. And that you should really start thinking about how can you do better here. And we would like to help. Thank you all very much.